Hello and welcome to writing your first SecureX orchestration workflow in 15 minutes. My name is Matt Vanderhorst and I'm a technical marketing engineer for Cisco SecureX. A little bit about me. I'm the subject matter expert for SecureX orchestration, and I'm responsible for helping Cisco engineers, customers, and partners get the most value out of the platform. I also maintain the orchestration GitHub repository you may have seen if you're using the product. In this session, we're going to take a look at a few different things. We're going to take a quick look at SecureX orchestration and what it is. We're going to look at how to build a simple workflow. We'll then build an atomic action, and then we'll look at how to put those two things together. So what is orchestration? SecureX orchestration is a cloud-based automation and orchestration engine, and it's included in the SecureX platform. There's no additional cost for orchestration, and it uses a no-to-low code drag and drop editor. So you can write your own content, as we'll see in this session, or you can import content from our GitHub repository. There aren't any restrictions on what you can integrate with, as long as the resources are reachable from the platform. And so what do I mean by what are those resources being reachable, right? So since SecureX orchestration is cloud-based, it has to have a path to the resources you want to integrate with. So if you have cloud-based resources that are internet accessible, orchestration can do any number of things. You can see a list here. We've got HTTP, AWS, Ansible. We've got some email targets, right? So there's all different things that orchestration can integrate with as long as it has that direct connectivity. Now, if you have on-premises resources that you want to integrate, so things behind your firewall, things that are not accessible from the internet, you do have to deploy a SecureX orchestration remote. And so this is a small virtual appliance. You can deploy it behind your firewall in your ESXi deployment, and it allows you to broker requests from the cloud to your on-premises resources. Now, the only limitation with this is, as of right now, SecureX orchestration remote only supports HTTP-based targets. So you cannot do email, you cannot do JDBC, you can't do any of those other target types you see on the left. As of right now, on-premises is restricted to that HTTP or HTTPS. There are plans in the future for that to expand, but as of right now, that is the limitation. So at a high level, right, orchestration is a drag and drop no-to-low code editor. It allows you to integrate pretty much whatever you want. And so now what we're going to do is do a demo. So I'm going to show how to build a simple workflow. We'll then convert that workflow to an atomic action, and then we'll use that atomic in another workflow. So we're going to kind of show the progression of building different types of content and how quickly you can actually start to build and use these things. All right, so jump over to Chrome. All right, so this is SecureX orchestration. And when we first log in, we're going to have our workflows list. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new workflow. Now, given the time of this session, I'm not going to cover the ins and outs of orchestration and do a walkthrough of the interface. I'm just going to focus on building some content and showing what you can do with the platform. At the end of the presentation, I'll share some links to our documentation and a video playlist and some other resources that will help you get started if you want to learn more or you're just getting started with the platform. So in this example, what we're going to do is I'm going to build a workflow that goes to Cisco Secure Endpoint and retrieves a computer's unique ID using its IP address. So the first thing we're going to do, we already clicked new workflow. We're going to give the workflow a name. So we'll say get secure endpoint GUID by IP. And workflows are kind of like functions, right? They're kind of like scripts in traditional programming. So what we're going to do is we're going to give it some inputs and outputs. So we're going to click, we want to add a variable. We're going to let it be a string, and we're going to do IP address. So we're going to input an IP address into this workflow, and it's going to go off to Cisco Secure Endpoint, do a search, get some information, and it's going to give us back that machine's unique ID, which we can then do something else with later. So we'll create an input variable for IP address. We'll mark it required because the workflow can't function without it. And then we're going to add an output variable. And so this will be the connector GUID. So this is what we're going to get back from Secure Endpoint. And we'll set this to output. Right? So we've got our IP address input, connector GUID output. And then the last thing we need to do at the workflow level is define a target. And so targets are those resources I mentioned earlier, right? Targets are the things that you can integrate with and communicate with from orchestration. So in this case, we're just going to say that we'll specify that target when we start the workflow. And then for the target type, we're going to say HTTP endpoint. So our target for Cisco Secure Endpoint is HTTP based. It's a normal REST API. So we can just leave that as HTTP. And what we're going to do is go in our toolbox on the left, and we're going to drag in an HTTP request. And so this activity is going to allow us to make an HTTP request to that API. And what we can do is we're going to inherit the target from the workflow, inherit the authentication from the workflow. We don't need to specify that, but what we do need to do is give a relative URL. And so what we're going to do is we're going to search for computers where internal IP equals, and we're going to use that input variable. So this is the variable browser. And so when you're working in orchestration, you'll notice a lot of fields and a lot of different things have this little puzzle piece. And the puzzle piece launches the variable browser, and this allows you to kind of poke through your workflow and pick and choose different variables to link things together. So in this case, we're going to go to workflow input IP address. So we're going to take that input variable that we gave the workflow. We're going to put that in the URL, and you can see that variable was inserted. And we're going to limit our search results to 1. Right? We only want 1 result. We don't need to do anything else here other than continue on HTTP error code. And really what that means is if for some reason we get 404 or some sort of an HTTP error, maybe the endpoint's not found, we can handle that gracefully instead of the workflow actually failing. And so to handle that gracefully, we can go to our logic section. And this is where we have things like loops and condition blocks and more advanced logic. We can bring in a condition block. And this is going to allow us to check what the result of that API request was, right? Was it successful or not? So we can just give this name, and it's a best practice to give things names, right? So we're going to say, was the request successful? And on the left, we're going to say, yes, we got a 200, which is a standard success in HTTP. And now we have to give a condition, right? So we're going to say, all right, puzzle piece, and this time we're going to go to activities. We're going to go to that HTTP request, and we're going to select its status code. So what you'll notice is different activities give you different outputs. So when we do an HTTP request, for example, we have things like headers, the response body, a status code, all of the things you would expect when you're making a web-based API call. So we'll grab that status code and we'll check for it to be equal to 200, right? So that's our success case. And on the right-hand side, if anything else happens, right? So we're gonna say if the status code is not equal to 200, so that's generally going to be an error condition of some sort, then we're going to use a completed block to end the workflow. But we're going to end it gracefully. So we're going to say that the workflow failed. We're going to say the completion type is failed. And then we're going to put a result message that says failed to search for endpoint in secure endpoint. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to include any additional information there, but in the real world, you could put more details. You could put the HTTP response body. You could put any number of things in there, depending on what you want to return. And then back on the success side, we're going to get JSON back, right? So this is a very common pattern. You make an API request. You're going to get some sort of JavaScript object notation or JSON formatted payload back. We need to extract a value from that. So one of the nice things is orchestration has support for that built in. So we can bring in a JSON path query object. And this is going to allow us to look at a body of JSON and extract information using a JSON path query. So the source JSON is going to be the response body. So the data coming back from that HTTP request. And then we're going to click add and add an actual JSON path query. So we'll do $.data 0 connector GUID. So this is going to fetch the first object in the list of results. So that's index 0 in data, and then get the connector GUID attribute. And that's the unique ID that we're looking for. And we'll just name that connector GUID. Okay, so we are going to make sure this saved. Connector GUID. Okay. So now what we need to do is we've made the API request. We've extracted the value that we want. and we need to set that output variable. Right now, the workflow has no output. So if we actually want to return that value, we're going to bring in a set variables. And this is going to allow us to update the workflow's output variable. So that's that connector GUID variable I created. We're going to update that with a new value. And the new value is going to be the result of the JSON path query. And what you'll notice is as the workflow builds and as the workflow has more complexity to it, there's more complexity in the variable browser, right? So now instead of just having that HTTP request, we can see our condition branch here where we said, was the request successful? And then underneath that, we've got our 200 success. And you can see that the variable browser kind of follows the hierarchy of the workflow. So you can kind of step through the workflow in the variable browser. And in this case, we want the JSON path query that we did. And we're going to use that connector GUID variable that we created, right? So that JSON path query is going to go to that payload of text, extract that value that we gave it a path for, put it in this output variable from that activity, and then we can use that variable later, in this case, to set an output variable. So we'll click Save there, and that's it. So all we have to do now is click Validate. The workflow is validated. There weren't any errors. And now if we want, we can click on Run. We're going to use our existing AMP target, so Cisco Secure Endpoint, but this target still happens to be called AMP. We're going to put in a test machine IP and click Run. And there's our workflow. So now what you can see is we have the runs view. So instead of this being the workflow editor, this is actually showing us the execution of the workflow. It looks very similar, but you can see each activity now is color-coded depending on whether it succeeded or failed. And in this case, everything was successful. But using this view, you can actually look at what the workflow did. So here on the properties on the right, we can see the IP address that I provided as input. And then we can see that connector ID that came out as output. And if you click through these individual blocks here, you can actually look at each individual activity and what it did. And so here for the HTTP request, we can see that internal IP was substituted into the URL. And we can see the JSON payload here that came back from Cisco Secure Endpoint. So there's the information about my computer. There's that computer ID. And then in this JSON path query, we can see that ID being extracted from that JSON payload. So now we have a workflow that can go to Cisco Secure Endpoint, take an IP address, and give you back a machine's unique ID. And that unique ID can now be used to do other things. So what we'll do is we'll actually convert this workflow to an atomic action. And so if you think about it, as you build these small components in orchestration, it's really quite simple, right? This only took us maybe 8 minutes or 5 minutes to build. And what we can do is now make this a reusable component, right? And that's the power of orchestration. We can now say, you know what, this is something useful that we might want to do over and over again. So let's make it reusable. So I'm going to go in here back into the properties in the workflow editor, and I'm going to check this is atomic workflow box. And then I'm going to select a group name, and this group name is going to tell orchestration where to list this object in that toolbox. And we'll take a look at that again in a second. So I'm going to say this is an atomic for Cisco Secure Endpoint. I'm going to click Validate again, and now we have an atomic action. Now, in fairness, right, this example was designed specifically to be reusable, and it was designed to look and behave like an atomic action. So not all workflows naturally make sense to be an atomic, right? Atomics are meant to be small, self-contained workflows that are kind of like a function in programming, right? You give them input, they do something with it, and then they give you some sort of an output. So they're very singular, simple transactions. This is a good example of that, right? We give it an IP and it gives us back an ID. So what we can do now is we can close out of this. We can go to our workflows and we can create a new workflow. And what we can do now is actually build a workflow using the atomic that we just made. So I'm going to make a workflow that isolates an endpoint. And so we're going to kind of play off that Cisco Secure Endpoint trend. And we're going to make a workflow that we can actually run to enable host isolation on an endpoint. And we're going to give this workflow an input variable as well. We'll use IP address again. Make that input, make it required. We're going to go down to the targets and we're going to say we want to execute on an HTTP endpoint. And in this case, we'll select our AMP target so that we don't have to provide it when we run the workflow. And then in our toolbox on the left, we're going to have a Cisco Secure Endpoint section now. And here's our Get Secure Endpoint GUID by IP, right? So this is the atomic action or workflow that we just created. We just made it an atomic, put it in the toolbox. So we can drag that in. And you'll notice that it looks and behaves like any other activity now. So we can transfer our workflow's input variable, similar to what we did before. We'll put that IP address input variable as input into that atomic action now. We're going to use the workflow target. So we've given the workflow Cisco Secure Endpoint as a target. So we're just going to inherit that. And then we're going to do isolate host. So I already wrote this isolate host atomic. It looks and feels very similar to the secure endpoint, getting the GUID by IP. And it expects that connector GUID, right? So now you can maybe see why we needed to convert that IP address to a unique ID, because we can't ask AMP or secure endpoint to do isolation based on an IP address, right? Because there might be ambiguity about which machine that is. So we can do it based on the machine's unique ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually give it the ID that's coming back from our atomic action, right? So in our variable browser under activities, we can see our atomic action that we created, and we can see that it has that connector GUID output variable that we created. So we can give that connector GUID into this activity. Again, we're going to use the workflow target, and that's it, right? So we've reused both of these components. Now I can run the workflow. I can put in 10.0.0.11 for my test machine and click run. First thing we'll do is we'll go out, we'll get that unique ID, right? Convert that IP address to unique ID. We can see the atomic has its own properties. So there's the IP address we gave it, and there's the unique ID that came back. And then we can click on isolate host and see that we're passing that unique ID through. Okay, so now we've built a second workflow using those atomics, two different functions that did two different singular things. We've now combined them into a workflow and made them into something a little more useful. All right. So if you're interested in orchestration, when you're ready to get started, or even if you've already started using it, we recommend checking out our documentation. So the documentation contains a wide variety of information about how to use the product, how various activities work, what workflows are available, and some of the best practices for both atomic actions and workflows, right? So when you're developing these things, we do have best practices we recommend you follow. And that helps to make sure that things are more portable and that things are going to be more stable in the production world, right? So making sure you're doing error handling, making sure that you're checking the result code for HTTP requests and things like that. And in this documentation, we also have a bunch of samples that are available. So we have a bunch of sample workflows you can download as you're learning the product. And these sample workflows show singular concepts. So instead of downloading a huge, complicated workflow, trying to pick it apart and understand each piece, you can just download a sample that shows you how to make an HTTP request, right? Very simple, easy to understand examples. And if you're interested in learning more about that on-premises SecureX orchestration remote I mentioned, there is a remote section in the documentation. So you can click on remote. It explains what the remote is, what it does, and then how you can deploy it if you're interested in deploying it. So here are the links, obviously, to the documentation that I just mentioned, our GitHub repository, as well as a video playlist on YouTube. So documentation, great place to learn, great place to get information about workflows we have available. The GitHub repository is a really great place to just look at the content, right? That's where the content lives. So you can go through our workflows folder, see what workflows we have. You can go through the atomic actions folder, see what atomic actions we have. And all that content can be simply imported into your orchestration tenant. So very simple and straightforward. And then finally, obviously, YouTube playlist. So we've got a bunch of videos that explain the product, how to get started, the basic terminology. We actually have some videos pretty similar to this one that talk about how to build your first workflow or build your first atomic action. So I'd like to thank you for attending this session about Cisco SecureX orchestration. Hopefully you found it useful and are excited to get in the product and play with it. That's the most fun. It's a really fun product to play with and get your hands dirty with. My name is Matt Vanderhorst, and until next time, take care.